Hey everyone. So I made a video about 4 years ago, I would say, about the best alliances in each season of Big Brother, and it was mainly a compilation video. Now I'm going to add on to that list to include the seasons that took place since that video, but I'm going to add my commentary regarding why I chose these alliances. So, with Big Brother 2, the only option is Nicole and Hardy. They bonded over the first few days, they had enough influence over the first few weeks where they were good socially and knew to whittle down Chilltown and picked up Will right before they flipped on their top alliance, and they knew that they needed to flip in order for them to get more control. Obviously, their power was strengthened by them winning a lot of HOHs in the middle portion of the game, but they knew how to position themselves well and they controlled most of the season. Of course, their one downfall was Dark Noel and acting a bit too cocky to the point where it affected their ability to win their jury vote, where their social game kind of deteriorated as the season went on, and they became a bit too reliant on competitions and cockiness to the point where they didn't get to the final two together. For Big Brother 3, there is no other choice but Danielle and Jason. They were another duo that ran the season, but unlike Nicole and Hardy, Danielle and Jason made it to the final three together. They didn't rely on competition wins to increase their power, and they were a secret duo. They both got close to the two sides of the house and took up people from each side of the house to create a power group of some sort, and that group was able to make it to the end. I do think that their main downfall was that they weren't able to win clutch competitions nearing the end, and they underestimated how likable Lisa was, to the point where they booted Amy instead of her in the final four, which wasn't the best decision. They controlled the season solely through strategic and social merits, and were the first main duo that many other alliances in future seasons would try to emulate. Big Brother 4 is another duo that I'm placing as the best alliance, and that is Jun and Alison. Unlike the other two pairs, these two were not formed from the beginning of the season compared to the other two, but they became a duo in the middle of the season, where Alison lost Nathan the week before and Jun lost Dana 2 weeks beforehand, and they were both two floaters in the middle of two main alliances. And they both recognized that the other were flirting, so they decided to float together and to pin both sides against each other. It worked very well for them, to the point where they, unlike the other two duos I mentioned, were able to make it to the final two together. But because their social game was pretty poor and they just weren't very likable, they realized that they can only go to the end with one another. Both of them were definitely the most adaptable and the most aware players of the season, hence them doing so well in the first place. Big Brother 5, I actually had a pretty hard time in figuring out who I should place. But I'm going to go with another duo, and it's not the duo some people may think, but it is Diane and Drew. It is ironic because Cowboy and Drew were in the Four Horsemen Alliance together in the beginning, and they were the finalists, but them as a duo didn't really control much, as Drew mainly went to Diane for a lot of those strategic and social decisions that drew the direction of the season. They became pretty close from the first few weeks, but it raised alarm signs with the others since they were supposedly in other alliances. Diane helped Drew move away from the Four Horsemen and to integrate himself very well with her alliance, and he had the social game to do so. From the jury onwards, they controlled essentially everything. They had good relationships with Adria and Natalie to the point where they felt comfortable in flipping on the Pinky Alliance. They had great relations with the Pinky Alliance, and they both knew when to turn on one another. The main fault of this duo was that Diane became a bit too reliant on Drew and started playing for him, and he wasn't giving her that same energy back, which is why he ended up cutting her in the final three instead of the final two. At Big Brother 6 is the friendship, and it's the first duo that I'm not putting on the list. I know the softs are obviously more likable for many other reasons, but simply put, the friendship just outplayed them from beginning to end essentially, after the Eric boot. The friendship had more trust with one another, which was a very hard task to do with April, Jennifer, and Yvette being in that alliance. But they had this cult-like mentality that caused them to thrive, and they took advantage of the weaknesses of the Saws, which we saw during Howie's HOH week, and when K-Star decided to throw the HOH competition to Jennifer. They kept their numbers from that point onwards, and they just dominated, whether you like them or not. They were clearly the superior alliance in this season, and made the better moves. They were also able to get both of their members to the final two. For Big Brother 7, there is no other choice but Chilltown. Obviously, they had the advantage of being a duo that knew each other very well outside of the house, and were business partners up to this point, as well as Boogie having a low profile compared to essentially everyone else on the Arsa cast, but simply put, they outplayed everyone. They made sure they had deals with the Softs. They also made sure they're in good relationships with the quote-unquote floaters. They knew when to form new alliances, like the Legion of Doom with James and Danielle, which caused them to get rid of some of the floaters that Chilltown wanted, and caused them to get rid of the other South members. But they also knew when to turn on their alliances, like turning on James and Danielle in the mid-jury portion, and riding with Janelle and Erica. Of course, their main downfall was emotionally manipulating some of the women to the point where it became a teetering edge, causing Janelle especially to turn on Will, and just being overconfident in general. For Big Brother 8, I choose America. I guess I can't choose America since it really isn't a player. A part of me really wants to choose Eric and Jessica, but they didn't make it to the end, and so much of the choices that were made for them was due to America. And I guess I have to choose the Detonators, since they did make the final two, but again, a lot of the decisions that caused them to get to the final two wasn't due to their own actions, but due to America once again. They played pretty solidly during the pre-jury phase, of course until Danielle decides to turn on the alliance that they were in. I don't remember the name of it right now. And her HH ends up failing. And then they do get out of being nominated the next week due to America. But the alliance between them, Eric, and Jessica were very strong. And they did know when to turn on Eric and Jessica, so I do give them props for that, I guess. For Big Brother 9, the only choice is Team Christ. Of course, when the early jury portion starts, or technically when the first final alliance started, that alliance kind of started to be formed once Sheila talked Ryan out of backdooring Matt and to send James home. They had power then, but then it got reversed due to the returnee twist and James winning HOH, so they did lose Matt. But from after that point onwards, Team Christ completely ran and dominated the rest of the season, and they were all pretty strong players in their own right. Though at the end, Adam and Ryan did start to outplay Natalie and Sheila, but the four of them did control a majority of the season, so they are here. So for Big Brother 10, we're going back to the duos in the Renegades, Memphis and Dan. Both of them kind of laid low during the pre-jury portion, though Memphis was close to going home during the last round of the pre-jury, but was ultimately saved. And then from the final line onwards, they had an alliance with Rainey and Keisha, but Memphis and Dan were the obvious power players in that alliance, not only regarding competitions, but strategic and social merit as well, and they completely dominated over everyone else. So they have to be here. There's really nothing else I really need to say about them. Big Brother 11 is such a hard season to talk about regarding the dominant alliance, since Jessie's alliance did run the first half of the season, but the coup d'etat completely threw things over a loop, and while Jeff and Jordan did make it to the final 5, they didn't get any power until the coup, and outside of that, whenever they did get power after that, they didn't really make the best choices. So I guess I'm choosing Jessie's alliance for some of the reasons that I stated earlier, and their dominance was due to natural gameplay and not convenient twists that were handed to them. And I was very impressed with how Kevin and Natalie kind of made a revival and a comeback during the latter part of the post-story portion of the season. So I do think they are overall stronger players, and I give Jessie's alliance a lot of credit for having power naturally and overcoming twists that were complete BS against them. Of course, for Big Brother 12 is the Brigade. What do I even really need to say about them? There are 4 powerful players who decided to pair off with others that weren't in their alliance so they could have a vote of 8 or 9, and they always controlled the voting and the information flow of the house from outright the beginning, and they would have their pairs go against the other pairs of their Brigade allies so they could go at one another and go after Brendan and Rachel. So they essentially always had power. And they knew when to turn on Matt as well, once they felt like he was developing relationships too much with the other sides, though Matt was still loyal to them. Ultimately, they're the blueprint of many of the alliances that would follow them. With Big Brother 13, I have no choice but to choose the Veteran Alliance. Not only because they had so many things in their favor, just from already playing beforehand, but the casting of the weaker newbies, the twists that happened, and obviously some of the newbies obviously gravitating towards the vets in general, and most of the newbies just outright sucking in the season. I don't really have anything else to say since they were essentially put in a very privileged position. So for Big Brother 14, the only major alliance that dominated from beginning to end was the Quack Pack, though technically you could say it was the foursome of Brittany, Dan, Danielle, and Shane. Danielle and Shane were clearly the strongest newbies of the cast, especially competitively, and they both had better social games, or at least Shane did, compared to Frank. And they also teamed up with the strongest veterans, socially and strategically, in Brittany and Dan. So they just dominated together, and Ian was linked to Brittany as well. So the 5 of them just completely ran through the season, though Dan would turn on Brittany pretty early on, but they were in a position where Frank was in power and one of them had to go. And even after Brittany's departure, the group essentially just dominated the rest of the season. Big Brother 15 is kind of difficult, but it really shouldn't be. I guess the Outsiders alliance that formed within, I would say, the first 2 to 3 weeks would be the dominant alliance, since they are the ones who had most of the power for most of the season. A lot of the power players like Andy, Amanda, so on and so forth, came from this group of people. The fact that they were able to cause everyone to flip on the moving company was pretty impressive, and they had some of the outside sanctions fight against one another for the first half of the game was very smart gameplay. Of course, there are sanctions in that majority alliance, like Helen and Alyssa on one side, Amanda and McCrae on one side, and then judges being somewhere. So essentially, they really dominated the season, and once they started going against one another, it became more interesting. Okay, so for the remaining seasons, I'm going to try to keep it short because, first of all, I don't like most of these seasons. I'm going to be straight up. And 2, they, for the most part, copied the format of Big Brother 12 and used it over and over and over again. So Big Brother 16 is obviously the Detonators. They were the bomb squad, but of course Devin self-destructed and they booted Amber for reasons. And while Caleb was quote-unquote booted, they essentially kept him around to be another unofficial member of the Detonators, where he did all of their doing as well. By the time Jury came around, there was only a few outsiders, so they just kind of got rid of them. And of course, the Battle of the Block twist helped them as well, especially since the people in the Alliance won most of the competitions. On to the next. So for Big Brother 17, it says Scamper Squad, and it's interesting to me because this wasn't the majority powerful alliance in the first week, but the other side was just so poor and they just self-destructed to the point where the Scamper Squad became the dominant alliance within the next few weeks. This was the 6th sense for the pre-jury, but of course Clay and Shelly were booted, but after they were gone, the rest of them and Steve just took over the rest of the season, and there's really no stopping them, as they were a strong force. For BB18, I'm actually struggling with coming up with a group of people. There was that veteran plus Polly and Tiffany alliance that was formed, but they self-destructed very quickly. Paul and Victor were heavily benefited from the two battle bags, and they themselves weren't that strong. I'm not adding Natalie and Jane because they weren't brought into things during the second half. So I guess I'm forced to choose Nicole and Corey, just mainly because they are a part of most of the majority of the powerful alliances from the first half and the second half of the season, where everyone wanted to work with them. They chose who to work with, and they chose which alliances to break, essentially. And they made it to the final four intact. So I guess I'm putting them here. So for BB19, it's of course Paul. But Paul is one person, so I'm just going to say Paul's cult. What's interesting about this was that, of course, there was a majority alliance between the Showmances and a few others in the first week, but Cody and Jessica just outright sucked. And Paul was in this alliance, but that alliance self-destructed because they decided to turn on Paul. But because Paul was a veteran and he was just a good player, he was able to turn the majority of the house into being his sheep. And as each of the weeks went on, like, for an example, week 4, after booting Dominique, he didn't need Mark and Elena anymore, so he dumped them from the alliance and ostracized them with Jessica and Cody. And everyone else who was a part of his main alliance, like Josh, Christmas, Alex, and Jason, won a majority of the competition, so he just kind of took over. And everyone within that main periphery of the alliance had deals with him, so he essentially chose who to go to the finals with. BB20 is the first season in a very long time that had two opposing alliances stick from the beginning to the end. But of course, Level 6 was the superior one. Not only just because they had Tyler on their side, and Tyler did most of the work during the first half of the season, but Faute and what would become the Hive were such a poor alliance that if anyone was against them, the other alliance would have been the majority alliance. From the jury portion onwards, Angela, Casey, and Tyler just won out for the rest of the season, and JC also helped them retain power as he got information from the likes of Fessy and Haley and so forth and reported it back to level 6, so they're here. So for BB21, I want to choose the alliance between Holly, Jackson, Nicole, and Cliff, since they essentially took over from, like, I would say the final 10 onwards, and they were the final 4, but I want to kind of just focus on Holly and Jackson, because they also were in the majority alliance, Grateful, in the pre-jury, and that turned into the alliance of 6, and then even though they kind of blew up the alliance, they were brought into another strong alliance in the second half and they just took over. So I'm just going to go with Holly and Jackson. And of course, they were in the final 2. And unlike Mike and Erica, Jackson and Holly worked together from beginning to end, and they are both pretty strong players on their own rights. And they were each other's number ones, unlike Boogie and Erica. So for Big Brother 22, it is the committee. Essentially, there's no other really solid alliances to go against them, since the people who weren't in the alliance thought they were close with people like Danielle, Enzo, Cody, Tyler, whomever else. So even them, they're kind of working for the committee for the first few weeks of the season. Essentially, all of them made it to the final 7, I believe, though it was a 6-person alliance. And Enzo was pretty much an honorary member, so I don't want to talk about this alliance anymore, so I'm just going to move on. And last but certainly not least is the Cookout from Big Brother 23. Of course, they all shared the same experience as being black people or being mixed with black, and they wanted to have the season be all about representation and having the first black winner. And I do respect that as a black person, but I don't like that many of them sacrificed their games just to have a black winner. I feel like you could play for a black winner as well as playing for yourself to win, but that's besides the point. Essentially, each of them had their own groups of people. So, like, Xavier was close to Alyssa and Christian, Azza and Derek were close to Brittany, Tiffany was close to Claire, Hannah was close to Derek X, Kylan was close to Sarah Beth. Essentially, they just used the formats that worked in Big Brother 12 with the Brigade, but used it even better here because obviously people didn't want to call out the fact that, all 6-pack people were working together, and they were able to essentially trick the entire cast. So that's very impressive. So overall, that is my updated list of the strongest alliances in each BB season. I'm probably going to do one for BB Can once it airs back up early next year, and yeah, thank you all for watching.